How would you describe the condition of the American labor movement generally in the United States right now?
Well, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that the labor movement is on death's doorstep. Right now, there's only about 10.7% of all workers that are members of unions. And if you separate that public and private, you'll find that there's only about 6% of private sector workers who are members of unions. And the private sector, as you know, as an economist, is infinitely bigger than the public sector. So I think we have a real problem on our hands. Many people have commented over the years that the great American middle class, the force most responsible for that, was the labor movement, especially the labor movement coming out of the Roosevelt coalition. Why did it happen that the labor movement has gotten so beat up? I think it's a perfect storm of the law. The law has been changed over and over again to make it harder and harder for unions to organize. You have to say that the courts have been responsible. Tremendous decisions by the courts have made union weapons less and less useful. Many of us learned years ago about the poor Danbury hatters in Danbury, Connecticut, who dared to leave a boycott against one of the hatting companies. And by the beginning of the 20th century, that was a major Supreme Court decision in which the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that a boycott violates the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, that law, as we all know, was developed to prevent conglomerates and cartels.
And monopolies.
And monopolies. Right. And what was it used for? To stop unions. Right. So things like that have really created this situation where unions are no longer able to organize, to represent people, except for the public sector and except for unusual places like New York, where unions maintain themselves, are still strong, still viable.
Okay, so tell us, how did they go from the strength they seemed to have, say, at the end of World War II, 1945, to the dire situation you just summarized?
Well, what happened first? What happened was the Depression. The Depression weakens our capitalist system enormously, allows for a imaginative, courageous leader like FDR to come in and say, we're going to boost demand. I have to boost demand. That's the other. Capitalism can't fight him anymore. They're dying. So he does that. He gets legislation planned, and the unions respond. There's the CIO, the great CIO, aggressive, imaginative. They go all over the country and organize everywhere. Big steel, big rubber, the auto workers, on and on. So you have those things to happen. Now, we then have World War II. Roosevelt enters the war, but he knows that he can't win this war without labor's cooperation. So he asks them, will you agree that there will be no strikes, no lockouts during the war, and we will arbitrate all your disputes? Most of the unions agree to that. He then dumps tons and tons of money into the economics of the United States. Planes, tanks, on and on and on it goes.
The government buying all those things.
What effect does that have? Well, it has many effects, but one of them is capitalism recovers. So while the workers are doing well, capitalism is also doing well. And so after the war, they're in the catbird seat. They run the world. American capitalism runs the world. Europe is destroyed. Japan is destroyed.
Soviet Union weakened.
Drastically weakened. Lost 40, 50 million people. And so only the United States has a functioning capitalist system. And now is the time for them to get back at these unions that have taken too much for them. So immediately after the war, 1947, Republicans take back Congress. They pass all kinds of legislation, the taft-hartley amendments, which make it easier for employers to resist unions in organizing campaigns, create right-to-work, so-called right-to-work states. By the way, there are now 28 of them in the United States. And then the greatest weapon of all is struck on, and that is anti-communism. The Soviet Union, which had been our great friends, our great allies, who lost more people in the war than all the other countries perhaps put together, is now our enemy. Right. And so the labor unions are accused of being communist-ridden, especially the CIO unions. Walter Reuther, the great progressive, beats up on the communists and the auto workers. The CIO in general dismisses 5 communist unions. So it's one after another attack on the union movement. The 50s, we see the Landrum-Griffin Act, which regulates how unions operate. It's an unrelenting attack on unions. And unfortunately, the labor movement has really not been able to respond in that kind of a way.
Could I ask you to amplify one thing? The purging of communists and socialists. It has been said that this deprived the labor movement of, not all, but many of the most active, the most militant, the most courageous leaders that they had. And so it was under the name anti-communism, what you were actually doing was decapitating the labor movement in a sense. Is that something that you've also found?
Your old colleague at UMass and my old professor at UMass, Saul Barkin, wrote a piece in 1962 because he was noticing then that the labor movement was declining. And one of the reasons he gives for it in 1962 is it lost its imagination and it's lost its heart. It lost the people who were providing the ideas that were magic to the American public. Those people were kicked out, booted out, and discredited. Now, I'm not a communist. I've never been a communist. And I've had, as we both have had, disagreements with them over the years. But nonetheless, you have to give them credit for being great organizers, and they were.
You couldn't kind of assault them for being great organizers of a successful movement.
Right.
So you had to find something else to tar them with to get them out of their positions.
Correct.
And the anti-communism
Right.
was the opportunity.
That's right. The poor Rosenbergs were killed because they were selling, atom bomb secrets or whatever the excuse was. All of that was really to discredit the role of the left in the labor movement.
Okay. That might explain the decline, say, from 1945, into the 1970s. But as we both know, the decline has continued.